Simon Kuper, you are a journalist, a writer, and not so very long ago wrote an article in the Financial Times entitled Proper English Rules OK. You are incidentally a native English speaker. I'd like to talk to you about this article, and beforehand would like to just run the gamut of varieties of English that exist in the world, very briefly, just to clarify matters, beginning maybe with Standard English or the Queen's English, which could possibly be defined as the most widely accepted version that is clear, proper English. Would that be acceptable to you?
Standard English, yes, it's what you hear on the BBC. It's the sort of most correct form. It's also associated in many people's minds with an upper class education or an establishment background, and so some people deride it on those grounds. But I think most people, if you speak Standard English, you will be accepted in almost any English language setting. It's not spoken by many native English speakers. Many native English speakers are not capable of speaking Standard English. They don't have the grammar or the vocabulary. And the other thing is that many people who are not native English speakers can speak Standard English because they've learned it at a wonderful school or something. Global English has a million varieties. I mean, the English spoken in an Indian state is going to be different from the English spoken in the South African households where my parents grew up. And so there's many idiosyncrasies that each form of global English had. And I think of my parents' English. They grew up in white Johannesburg, and it would have been a mix of Afrikaans, some words from African languages, mostly command form, like Tula, be quiet, Woza, come here, which is Zulu words, Fortsak, go away, which is Afrikaans, the odd Yiddish expression, so it'd be a mix of different languages. And when I also think of the language of South African blacks, which is different again from how South African whites speak their version of global English, South African blacks often say too as an amplifier. He is too nice, meaning he is very nice. Or he even is also used as an amplifier. He is even too nice. So all these different forms of global English have their own uniqueness, which is extremely attractive, and a lot of writers have played with those different forms. So I would say Pidgin English is quite a low form of English in that people have a very small vocabulary. They're not familiar with grammar rules. They are using very large chunks of foreign languages. I've heard that in the Philippines, and even read it in their newspapers, where the writer will be writing something in English, and then suddenly there'll be 60 words of what I imagined was Tagalog right in the middle of it. And Filipinos seem to me to speak mostly Tagalog or different other dialects, and then they'll drop in some English. So I guess there you're talking about Pidgin English. I would guess that in some Asian countries, like Malaysia, that might be more common. I think the difference is that global English is recognisably English. It's say 90% English, whereas Pidgin English might be more 30% or less English. Broken English is what you get at customs in a developing country, where they say, you go there. And then you get to the bar and they say, you want beer? And so there are no articles. They don't say a or the, and the whole vocabulary is maybe 200 words, and it's strictly directional and informational. It's telling you what you can do or what you mustn't do. It's not about thoughts or ideas or fantasies. Everyone's been exposed to Globish. And one of the dangers of Globish is because the vocabulary is so basic, and because the syntax is often mangled, it often offends native English speakers. It's a bit unfair of us to take offence, because we're forcing the other person to speak our language. The other person would prefer us to speak Mandarin Chinese or Italian, but we don't. We make them speak Globish. And so they do, and then we're offended by the ugliness of it. So I think that's something that Globish speakers often don't take into account. And one problem with Globish also is that often people who speak Globish think they're speaking English. So the person who says at a conference, now I tell you about, he thinks he's speaking English. To us, he's speaking this sort of low and ugly form of it. So we automatically detract points from what we perceive to be his IQ, and he doesn't know that. It's a very unfair judgment, but we make that judgment as native English speakers. Well, I've been to this conference. I presented a conference on the environment in Rotterdam, and the attendees were all people working on environmental measures in Northern Europe. So they were Germans and Dutch and Belgians and Northern Frenchmen. And we asked all these people, do you want to give your presentation in English or do you want to give it in your own language? And they all said, no, I'll give it in English. My English is fine. These people spoke, as you do when speaking a foreign language, without nuance, without irony. They didn't know where to emphasize the word, and which made it very hard to listen to. So people would turn off, would switch off. And it struck me then that these people were speaking Globish, but they thought they were speaking English. And because they were speaking Globish, their message was lost and nobody was listening. And I spoke to one of the interpreters, and he said, I don't know why I'm here, because I'm not doing anything for 2 days. He was sitting in the booth unemployed. And at the conference, whenever an English person or an English speaker or an Irishman or an American would speak, everyone would suddenly wake up and the audience would suddenly listen, because for once there was a speaker who could make jokes, who could modulate, who was a pleasure to listen to. English speakers don't really understand our own dominance. We don't understand this enormous gift. I mean, I feel I'm in a better position to understand it than most English speakers because I live in France and I speak basic French. And I know that when I speak French, my IQ is, as perceived by others, 30 points lower even than it is in English. And I know that when I speak French, I can't use nuance, I can't use irony, I sound like an idiot. And French people don't really want to talk to me or listen to me. And I know that that's the way it works, vice versa, when a French person speaks English. It's deeply unfair, but it's the way the world works, that English does rule in many situations, and it's something that foreigners need to understand the mechanics of, and they need to understand that speaking Globish is not the same as speaking English. Speaking Globish does not get you all the way there. Speaking Globish in your corporation or in your organization will get your IQ, as perceived by others, marked down 30 points.
When does global English cease to be good enough?
Well, it's good enough when there's something that needs to be done that moment. And that's when, a friend of mine, a Dutch guy, comes here to sell and buy art to Paris. And he speaks English to French people. And he says, normally when you try and speak English to Parisians, it's very difficult and they pretend not to understand you. And he says, suddenly, when you talk about money, suddenly they understand everything. And when you're saying, I want to buy that painting from you, how much is it? And there's something immediately to be earned on both sides, everyone suddenly understands. Just as at customs where they say, where are you from? You say, you give the language, you give your country and they understand you. When there's a transaction which is very direct, basic English is fine. When it comes to something more subtle, like let me explain to you my theory of relativity, or let me explain to you why China is going to be the next superpower or not, or let me explain to you the measures that would be ideally required for our city to go green, then, and it takes more than 4 minutes, then people won't listen if you speak basic English. Then you need standard English to get people to listen, to impress them, to interest them. You need good English in other situations. You need it when you want to charm somebody. You need it when you want to make people laugh. In those situations, basic English doesn't suffice. So much is lost when people speak basic English, and the sad thing is often they don't realize it themselves because their grasp of English is so poor that they don't realize that they are dumbing down their message. I think you have to accept that global English is necessary, but that often it's a handicap. And people often think it's enough. They think, well, I speak English. And then you say to them, yeah, but you're a German. Compare your quality of English to your quality of German. And they would have to say, well, my German is 400 times better. And then you say, yeah, but how much are you leaving out in English? How much of your humour and nuance and intelligence are you losing when you speak English? So global English is much better than no English, but it's not as good as proper English, as standard English. And if you can't speak standard English, then there are situations where your global English will not be good enough. People need to understand that there are these two levels of English, and global English does not take you all the way. As Orwell said, good prose is like a window pane. I think he was actually quoting Somerset Maugham, but anyway, he said good prose is like a window pane, and the clean beats of that sentence, that's the kind of English that, as a foreigner, you can aspire to.